Imagine you picked up the most important book in the world. A book with words that can transform hearts. Included in this book are highlights and notes in the margin. This is the Notable Podcast, and these are the discussions of twin pastors who share their underlining and highlighting with you. This is Season 7, Life Reframed, a podcast on Ecclesiastes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Notable Podcast. We are back. One quick note before I say anything else. We are not going to be on Wednesday night next week. We are Tuesday night next week at 8 p.m. Eastern. So not Wednesday next week, Tuesday next week.
Tell everyone why, though. We're not moving to a new night.
No, we're not. It's just for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, so we're thinking that some of you may be traveling next week on Wednesday night, going into the holiday on Thanksgiving Day. So Tuesday night next week, 8 o'clock, we're going to kick off our next episode of Life Reframed with Ecclesiastes. Sorry to butt in.
Donate at notablepodcast.com.
Subscribe
everywhere.
Yeah.
Share it with people you know and love.
And thanks for being with us here tonight.
We got an exciting podcast tonight.
Are you going to tell everybody what's on the docket?
On this episode, what we're going to do, we're calling this episode The Forest for the Trees. And our goal by the end of this podcast is to give you the tools to be able to get into the book of Ecclesiastes and walk away with a coherent overall message.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I got two reasons why this is a really, really important episode to get into. The first one is this. I think it was in our first episode called Life Reframed where we talked about how Ecclesiastes is like an octopus with and then I took some flack for this one here at home. I was wondering how many arms the octopus has.
Right.
But the whole, like, trying to pull the legs in, right? And then you have one, we said that there was one that was always kind of escaping. And the book of Ecclesiastes can feel like that. And this is why it can be a hard book to read, actually. When I want you to picture, like, trying to take a message home as this big slippery ball, and you want to carry it with you in your heart, but there's no handles for it. So you try to grab it and it's greasy, and it just every time you try to grip it tighter, it just pops away from you. And reading the book of Ecclesiastes can be like that. So the first reason why this episode is going to be really, really key is we're going to give you handles for reading this book. The second reason why this episode is going to be really, really key is because we're gonna come clean with you now. There's no way that we can possibly go through every single verse in this book. And I apologize if we misled you, but there's so many little exegetical and interpretive hermeneutical rabbit holes that we could go down in this book that we just can't. So what we want to do is give you, the listener, the reader, handles for this book so that when you're reading it, you yourself can take away the gold that is really, really in there. And then, so through the rest of this podcast, what we're going to do is pick up some really big themes. So I just wanted to remind people where we've come from in this podcast, show you a little bit what we're going to do tonight, and then also kind of show you exactly where we're going to be going throughout the rest of this season. So if you can go back to podcast number 1, we did an introduction to the book. It was Life Reframed. And then we went East of Eden. And in East of Eden, we really did this prologue, if you're looking at the screen there, and we talked about the meaning there. The next episode, we did an episode called Not Far Apart, and we covered all the way from Ecclesiastes 1 verse 12, all the way really up to 2 verse 23. And that was the one where we cut off, and the last word of the episode was Jesus. Then we had an episode on this Carpe Diem passage, and then we rode those Carpe Diem passages kind of like a surfer on a wave through the rest of the book. So we picked up that theme. The episode last week, then, we picked up, where's that word? Pleasure. We talked about this relationship that we have with God, and how it is that we come into a pleasing relationship with Him. So we have covered, I think, really, really well. We've done 5 hours of teaching already on chapters 1 to 2. And now what we're going to do tonight is give you handles. So here we are. We're going to go forward from chapter 3 and give you some handles to take the rest of this book in, so that, and then in further episodes after this, what we're going to do is kind of like we did with Carpe Diem. We're going to follow like a thread or like a surfer on a wave some of the thematic elements like injustice, money, revenues, investments, some of these topics that keep coming up throughout the book. Did I say that well, Jonathan? Hope I did.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add at this point is get excited about this. I remember my own experience with the book of Ecclesiastes. I read it, and then there's parts of it where there was so much in there that I couldn't. You were talking about like a greased ball, but I was thinking about a greased pig. Have you ever
greased pig, yeah. We're from Minnesota, like
county fair. Yeah. People wrestle those things at county fairs. At least they used to. At any rate, it is hard to get a hold of. I like that metaphor, but I think by the end of tonight, you'll be able to see the big picture, the forest for the trees, and it's really going to comfort your heart. I know it is, because it comforts mine. You'll see.
And that's really the big goal. So we want to show you the forest for the trees. We're going to see the problems with trying to put handles on Ecclesiastes, some of the difficulties with doing that. We're going to give you a proposal for like how can we carry this book away in our hearts, and then we want to show you exactly why it's so saving to do that and so healing to do that. So we want to start by just showing you some of the difficulties of trying to package up, if you will, or put handles on the book, outline it, some people call it, or talk about its structure. And I wanted to do that just by getting into some of these verses here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I want to start by just kind of showing you on a micro level, so like a smaller level, some of the difficulties of how does this book flow? Like what's its message, and how does it stay connected to itself? And right away in chapter 3, we run into a difficulty, and this is just an advertisement. Anyone from Peace and Aiken who's on here tonight, anyone from Sure Foundation in Queens, New York, we're gonna close out the church here with a detailed and powerful preaching of Ecclesiastes 3 this Sunday, and so we're not gonna
watch out, Peace. We're coming.
Yeah. So we're gonna cover this in more depth then. But what suffice it to say for right now, that this poem is very enigmatic. It's ambiguous. It's very difficult to interpret, especially if it had no context. So what does that even mean? There's a time for everything, a season for everything. Come on Sunday, we'll do more of that. and anyone on the podcast can feel free to listen in as well. But for the purpose of this podcast, I just wanted you to see like a major new theme is time, and he's going to talk about time like crazy. And then right here, what you want to do with Ecclesiastes is to read it sensitively, is to understand that what he says next interprets. It's going to interpret that poem right there. And the reason why we can get momentum on that is because look at this. He's still talking about time. He's still talking about time. Now, this is where things get interesting. As the chapter goes on, then it seems like, here we go. He changes themes. So all of a sudden, he was talking about the tyranny of time, and now what just happened? Why are we talking about injustice? But here's the thing. We haven't quite all the way left behind the theme of time. So it's still there. Now, the NIV thinks that this is the end of a section. But if you kind of keep reading, we're still talking about injustice. So what's going on here? What's going on here? So one of the things that we have to understand about the teacher is that the way that he lays out his teaching is kind of like a color wheel. That's the best way that I can put it. So if at the beginning of chapter 3, we're talking about the tyranny of time and how it frustrates us. He turns the wheel just a little bit, this color wheel, and now all of a sudden we haven't quite all the way left behind the theme of time, but we're moving into a new color. So it might be like brownish or maroonish or something like that. And the wheel keeps turning where at some point we have left time completely behind. So there's no more red in there. And now we've moved into injustice. And that's kind of how a lot of the book of Ecclesiastes works. There's no clear endings and there's no clear beginnings. The colors kind of just blur together. Is this making sense what I'm saying? I hope it is. Do you want to jump in on that at all, Jonathan?
He's blending ideas through the section, but he is keeping a theme prevalent.
Exactly. And so that's one of the problems of Ecclesiastes. A lot of times there's no clear thematic shift. There's no indicator that we're talking about a new thing, and we have to struggle and piece together when he's finally totally moved on to a new point. The same problem happens on a macro level. So if we looked at the micro level, on the macro level, the same problem occurs. So it's almost as if, so as a preacher, as I was going through this book, one of my main concerns, a big concern of mine, and I think, Jonathan, you had it too, is how can I not make sure to repeat myself? It's like a preacher's nightmare that people are going to be like, didn't you just say that last week? You know? And it gets even more difficult the more years you stay at a church. What were you going to say?
No, we'll see. Like, that's actually going to lend itself to how we're going to bring coherence to the book. But that's absolutely right. He does repeat ideas thematically and rise to the same climaxes. We've already seen that with Carpe Diem.
Quite a bit. And Carpe Diem's not the only theme that will come forward. There's going to be other themes as well. So it's not like a chapter book where with Aristotelian logic where I finished that argument, I'm not going to return to it. I'm going to move on to a new thing. It's like this color wheel, but he feels free to come back to it. And so that's one of these are some of the challenges with the book of Ecclesiastes. And frankly, like if you get into some of the scholarship on this book, like how is this book laid out? there is no unanimity among the scholars. There's a lot of proposals. Some people see that it's a logical division to the book. So you have a lot of people see 4 parts to the book of Ecclesiastes, where you see the problem, the theological question that he's asking, and then what he comes back with is the ethical response. So what does it mean to live with this truth in your heart? And then he does it again. He's got another question with the ethical response. But you look at that, and it's not quite that clean. Other scholars will look at this book, especially like the proverbial section. So I'm going to scroll ahead to some of the proverbial sections. So chapter 4 has got some proverbs here. So there will be scholars that will say what the book is kind of like a spiral, where there's proverbial sayings and then reflections on the proverbial sayings. So some people will say that. And then other people say there's no outline here at all. And Fox is one of those commentators, and he said this: there's less effect on interpretation because of the outline, he's saying, than a ghost in the attic. So I like that. So nobody's going to get scared by a ghost in the attic. Like, the ghost actually has to leave the attic. And his point is, like, why are we even trying to outline this thing? And frankly, this is maybe just a little bit of a side note, but outlines really come out of the Enlightenment period. And it's nice for us as Westerners, people who have been trained in humanism, in Enlightenment thinking, to think that we can slap an outline on it, put it a box and bow it up, and then we're like, oh, now we can really, really get Ecclesiastes. But Ecclesiastes isn't ever going to be that simple. And instead, what we need to do with Ecclesiastes is think about it organically. We need to think about it organically. So, literarily. So it's not a scientific thing. It's not a logical thing. It's an organic thing, like a tree or like a river with eddies that just explodes. So think about a tree that there's explosion of the trunk that goes out and then spreads out. This is how we need to think about the book of Ecclesiastes. But that does cause a problem for us. Like, how do we put handles on it then, Jonathan?
It causes, I want to say 2 things about that. Not one, just respond to what you were saying, is we Westerners think that we have grasped something when we've put it in our heads. And this is a major bias that we have. This book, it's not a problem that this book doesn't have an outline that's really obvious to us. It's a blessing, because what we have to do is not just know things, truth propositions from the book, but we actually have to be deeply affected by those truths. We have to be one to them, condemned by them, live in them. And that's what makes Ecclesiastes so powerful and effective. And that kind of leads me into this next part. There is thought, there is order to this book. And the proof is the teacher tells you that. the preacher Colette tells you that. So what we were going to do just for a second is read the book backwards. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you Ecclesiastes chapter 12. This is verses 9 and 10. So
I got it up on the screen too for you.
Sweet.
Just so you know. Yeah.
He says, not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. So let's just take that apart for a second and realize that there's a plan and there's a purpose to this book, just like there is to creation itself. So the first thing I want you to notice is something about the teacher. The teacher is not only wise, but he also is able to impart that wisdom. Now, this maybe doesn't sound significant, but it's actually pretty significant. I thought of a few examples of why this is significant. You can have a good preacher who has no idea how to teach preaching or tell anybody else how to do it. You can have an amazing writer who has no idea how to communicate, how to write well. You can have a person who's good at living life under God and have no idea how to teach that or share the truths that are already embedded in their heart with somebody else. So the gift here, and what the teacher is saying, is that he not only is a wise person, but he has the ability now to communicate that said wisdom. And this is, of course, the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, here's the next thing he says.
One note about this. This is a very interesting way of talking about himself. This is like that Seinfeld episode where the guy always he referred to himself in the third person, and Solomon's been pretty used to actually using the first person. I don't know if it's because of humility or something else, but all of a sudden he's talking about himself in the third person. He was saying, that guy who just wrote that book, he's pretty wise. Anyway, it's a pretty interesting thing to consider. It's a little bit of a sidelight, but it is, I think, important to note.
It is. He's giving himself in a self-evaluation, but we can't tell it. And maybe he's just getting out of the way of himself there. The next thing that he says here is he makes this claim that he was very thoughtful about ordering his work. So he says he pondered this, he searched it out, he did arrange it. He arranged his mashal. Now, I do want to be clear about this. The Hebrew lexicons are going to tell us that this is more than just the ordering of the proverbs in the book, but that this mashal refers to the entire work that is Ecclesiastes. So the preacher is understanding that this is really meant to be consumed as one organic, moving spiritual entity. And what he did is he thought hard, and of course the Spirit's leading him to put this together. So listen to that claim. He's saying, I ordered this thing. There's a strategy here. This is like, oh, I think this is a nice thought, or this just came to mind. He's actually thinking about us and how we can be led more deeply into the teaching.
And that makes sense that he would do that. That's what God does. Like when he took creation, he created everything, and it was formless and empty, and then he put it in order. Like, and Paul talks about how we want to have orderly worship. It would make no sense at all if we had a book in Scripture that wasn't set in order by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And here the teacher's saying that's exactly what he did. So the challenge in front of us is, well, what is the order? Like, what is the flow, the organic way that it comes to us? But sorry to butt in on that.
So exactly, Solomon's being led by this Spirit who breathes into the world. Now, the next thing that I want you to notice is that he chooses words, and he orders all this stuff, and he chooses it, and he uses two descriptors for this. I'm not real happy with the NIV here on this translation. So these are truthful words. The other thing is they're not just right; they're pleasurable. What he's saying is that these words are aesthetically pleasing. They're beautiful. They're right. They engage you. They draw you in. So in other words, the preacher here, the teacher Colette, he's not only giving you truth, but he's giving us truth in such a way that we can sort of imbibe it, that we can live in it, that we can be grasped almost by it. And so this is very, very important. So God's word needs a hearing. And what God does through his word and by his Spirit is he gives us ways, forms and genres and beautiful language that draws us in so that we meditate on it.
And that's exactly what he does throughout the book. And I know in just a second we're gonna throw people those handles. I won't call it an outline. I don't really like that word for it, but to be able to have those handles, to see that order that he has in his arguments, and how it really is just this very saving word that he gives to us.
There's a Emily Dickinson poem that helps us think about a little bit how the Kohelet does this. She once wrote, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." Now, Emily Dickinson, she's emphasizing the fact that indirect communication is a powerful form of rhetoric that allows us to contemplate things that we wouldn't otherwise contemplate. I might put it like this, that truth needs to be coupled with love. And in a setting of communication, we all know that we can't hear anything unless we feel safe. And so what Solomon does is he puts all of that together into this beautiful work, a masterpiece. It's not a mess, it's a masterpiece for us to consider.
That's it. And so take us into it, Jonathan. Like, what's the beauty? This is not a formless and empty book. This is a beautiful, it's pleasant, it's right, and it's ordered. Show that to us, or at least make an argument for us.
Let me ground this just a little bit. There's a lot of good scholarship that would agree with the flow that we're going to propose, and even if people don't agree with it, that's okay. I think people will have to agree at the very least that it is useful. Now, this is the flow that we think is useful was actually proposed in the Princeton Review back in 1857. And there's commentators from Weihinger, Kyle, and then Kaiser, who have done some work in this direction too. So this isn't just throwing names out there. It's just to say that we're not out on a limb. This is not just pulling stuff out of a hat. This isn't just the Borman brothers. There's a lot of good work that has been done here, and a lot of credible people who have thought hard about this word from God. And it sets up like this. I mean, the most obvious division is the one that we've been touting here. You got 4 major divisions. The first one is the one that we've gone over, and that's chapter 1. And then it goes through 226. We're asking there, what is the meaning of life? What is true satisfaction? What is gain? And there
I'm gonna go slow for me, because I'm gonna try to show this to people. I got the text of Ecclesiastes up, and I want to show this to people, like where the new. So this is part 1. That's what we covered in episodes 1 to 5.
And yeah, so there we're saying that the gain isn't in gratification itself. It is being rooted in a proper relationship with God. And so we said that. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but this is something that's helpful to mark in your Bibles. Like, if this is a notable podcast, like, this is good. Like,
this is going to help.
It's going to help you read it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
so, like,
help you read
use a pencil if you don't. If the text is sacred to you, and I know it is. But it'll
help you see where the climaxes are. Exactly. So your first, penultimate climax in the book is 226 then. And then that brings us to our second flow, or our second argument that Solomon is going to make. And that it starts in chapter 3, verse 1. And then it's going to run through 520. Now, the argument that Solomon makes here, and you all need to stop in for church on Sunday at one of our two places. But the argument, this is incredible. But the argument that that Solomon makes is that God has a beautiful sovereign plan for us. That's what we're going to say. God has set these times and these seasons. He has this beautiful sovereign plan. And this is the force of the poetry there, that we can't see the plan, we just experience the plan, and we must trust the plan. So we're called to faith in the plan. But now, so this is his big thesis, right? God has a big, beautiful, saving plan. And now he's going to defend it. This is what he's going to do in the rest of the chapter. Starting in 3 verse 16, he's going to start defending the plan. So God has a big, beautiful plan, and Solomon's going to say, but, and he's got these little bits of rhetoric that show you that he's struggling with this plan. So in 3:16, he says, and I saw injustice, right, in a place where there should have been justice. In 3:18, he's going to say, and I said to myself, it's so bad that humans are like animals. And we're going to talk about that. Then in 4:1, he looks again and he says, oh man, where's the big, beautiful plan? I don't see this. I don't see God's saving, sovereign, beautiful plan. I see people being oppressed. So he's wrestling with these things. I don't see God's big, beautiful plan. In 4:4, he sees envy. This is what's where's the big, beautiful plan? I just see a whole bunch of people who are envious of each other's stuff, and that's why they work so hard. Same 4:7, I saw loneliness. I saw the problem of foolish leadership, right? and people who aren't living for their populace. So again and again and again, we see all of these different problems passing up. And then in chapter 5, then you start to see Solomon proposing, this is what we should do about this. There's some mystery here. And that brings us to 5 verse 1, where all of a sudden he says, look humans, when you come into the house of God, zip it. It's not quite what he says, but you're going to want to do more listening than speaking. You don't want to come in there and bribe God. God has a big, beautiful, sovereign plan, and we want to fear God when we come into his temple. And then he closes that, wrestling with the idea of wealth and money. And Solomon is, again, he's saying, look, this stuff doesn't have a huge impact on God's good, sovereign, saving plan. And then he ends up bringing it all the way up to a carpe diem and saying, look, when you realize God has this big, beautiful, sovereign plan, and we've gone through these various rebuttals, this is what I want you to do. Enjoy life. Let God have it. So that's the second part.
Beautiful. Yeah. So that's we've gone through 2 parts now. 5 episodes we spent on part 1, but I think that was really, really necessary to do. We just burned through, like, in 5 minutes probably, part 2. And I just wanted to notice, like, how integral the Carpe Diem passages are to the whole argument of the book. Here, part 2 culminates. It really culminates with the Carpe Diem. So this is what a beautiful book. Just a beautiful, hopeful book. You want to take us into part 3?
By the way, this is just an aside. Don't despair. This isn't a great injustice. We are going to come back to injustice.
We are. And we'll talk about wealth and possessions and the problem of death and judgment. These are coming in further episodes. Yeah.
It's coming. So then that brings us to our next section. If you're taking notes in your Bible, which is definitely worth doing, the next big section starts at 6 verse 1, and it goes through 7 verse 15. And I'll tell you, when I understood this section of Ecclesiastes, this really comforted me. So here's the deal. So we got 2 big theses, right? Right relationship with God enables the enjoyment of his gifts, and this is gain in life. That's the first thesis. The second thesis is that God is a sovereign God He's working out everything according to a beautiful sovereign plan. Then what Solomon is doing is wrestling with this some more. We all have these questions in life. What happens when we don't experience prosperity then? Solomon, you say there's this big, beautiful saving plan, but I'm not seeing it. And what Solomon does in this section is he says, it is more just and it is more right than you know. So there's two sides to this. The first thing he says is what happens to you on the outside is more right than you know. So he makes an argument. Let's say you're poor or something like that, and you're saying, how's this part of God's great, big, beautiful plan? Solomon comes along in verses 6:1 through 12, and he says, wait a minute. Prosperity like that is not always good. And we're going to talk about that. That's his argument, though.
We got a whole episode on that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming. So you don't have as much money as you think you should, and other people do. And God, how is this just? How is this right? This wicked person is, and Solomon says, look, prosperity is not what you think it is. The next thing that Solomon says is that God, this is so huge, God isolates the enjoyment of the gift from the gift itself. So track with that. Just because you have something does not mean that God allows you to enjoy it. And so Solomon makes this is just a key. God is more fair than you know. So God might give somebody $1 bazillion and they are completely miserable. So you look at it from the outside and you say, this isn't fair, Lord. This isn't fair at all. And Solomon says, oh, yeah, it is.
Don't be so sure that you're making the right judgments.
Right. So Solomon, you see how he's leading us here to trust. Then in 7:16 to 19, what happens to you from the inside out is more right than you know. So let's say negative things happen to you. It's not just you lack positive things or like wealth and prosperity, but that you actually suffer. You actually suffer. And what Solomon starts to argue, starting at the beginning of chapter 7, is that suffering actually might be a blessing. It actually might be a blessing. So on the first part, he's saying, oh, this is so unjust. We don't have as much prosperity as other people. And Solomon says, don't be so sure. And then you suffer and you say, oh, this isn't fair either. And Solomon says, don't be so sure. This suffering might be good for you. And look, let me just take you through some of these proverbs. He's got a whole bunch of proverbs that really kind of speak into this. I won't do them all, but I will do some of them. So he says in 7 verse 1, he says having a good reputation is better than having a nice funeral. That's a paraphrase of its interpretation of it. Good reputation is better than a nice funeral because your name can live on and be something. You can be a person to emulate and imitate after death. The next thing he says, what happens at a funeral in the house of sadness is much more profound. This is 7 verse 2. Than if life was just merry all the time. But all of you can think of examples of this. I remember it was just recently, my poor little puppy just busted her leg real bad. I mean, it was just real bad. And there we are sitting in this animal hospital, and I'm sitting there with my wife and my wife's aunt, and we just had the most profound conversation. There we are in a place of sadness and grief, and this is where life is happening. So there's tremendous amount of wisdom when you're not full of joviality and just enjoying life all the time. You're actually, this is 7:3 and 4. You're opened up to wisdom. When you're not drinking your life away. Like I said, you're just always sort of sloshed in joviality, whether that's real. Dealing with real alcohol or not. 7:7, money does horrible things. it can take a wise person and turn them into a fool. So all of this, I hope people are seeing it. All of this is showing that suffering isn't what you think it is necessarily. It can actually be a gift that God is placing into your life.
So what he's kind of doing is he's pushing back on common misconceptions that rich people are happier than poor people, and that it's better not to mourn. Like everything that we kind of believe on life, he's like, are you really sure about that kind of belief that you have about mourning or about money or whatever it might be? He's saying you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be.
Right. And the rest of the chapter, 7:15, and then going down, shows that God really is just. And we had a whole podcast, not to be self-promotional, on the doctrine of justification, the gospel according to Solomon. And you just got to go, listen to that to see how just is, and your heart will thrill to God. I know mine certainly did. I did want to make one aside, Timothy, on that. Please don't be distracted by what many people today are going to perceive as possibly misogynistic comment from Solomon as you read the back half of that chapter. This is one of those verses that a lot of people have trouble with. Solomon here talks about among 1,000 women, he couldn't find even one. What's the language there, Timothy? Who was upright among them all. And so some people take this to be a misogynistic comment. It's really not understood in the way that Solomon has it. I'll just make a quick argument for that. One is, and a lot of commentators do this with a wink. I'm not going to do it with a wink. Solomon was no misogynist. And on the front of the book, of course, he gets himself in trouble because he's got a harem, and this is a problem. But actually, and this is why I'm doing it not with a wink, is that he really does support monogamy in the book, and he really, in the rest of his work, Song of Songs is another example of this. He has a high regard for women, but here he is commenting on his own life. He does have this many women, and he pursues unbelievers, Timothy. He pursues unbelievers. So one of the, and amongst unbelievers, this is true. One of the scholars that you can read on this is Dr. John Brugge. What he says is that Solomon went looking for love in all the wrong places: Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, places like that. And if he would have looked for a woman among the people of God, he wouldn't have been led astray into idolatry in his life, and he certainly would have found an upright woman. Not to undo the point of justification by faith alone, by the way. It's just not a misogynistic comment.
Right, and it can be easily thought of that way if you don't have that background on Solomon's life. Like if a man just kind of just comes out with that without having Solomon's really very wicked experience. And look, would an upright woman become the 990th wife of Solomon? It shouldn't surprise us that among the 1,000 women that he had in his life that they were not upright. No, the upright women, I know so many upright women, it's not even funny, and they wouldn't have touched Solomon with a 10-foot pole. So,
and any upright man would have said run.
Yeah, I know. So.
At least at that point in his life.
Yeah.
So here we are. I want to get back into this. Suffering isn't what you think it is, which, by the way, should make us think of all kinds of New Testament passages. our Father in heaven disciplines those he loves. And prosperity isn't what you think it is either. People can have a lot of money, they might not enjoy it, or something like that. And then you have the end of the section, which is just 8:2-15. You have Solomon saying a lot of what undoes unrighteousness and injustice is actually good civil government, and we all know that too. So that's the third big part. When we trust it, Solomon says, when we trust this, then we can just live our lives. We can entrust the government piece to God, and that's the third big section.
All right.
We got one last section.
Yeah. Where does it begin? 8:16.
Yep, 8:16, and then really it goes to the end of the book, depending on how you want to break it up. We'll just say to the end of the book to make it easy.
Here's part 4.
And what I like to say about this section is that really now we've wrapped up a lot of the rebuttals, and what Solomon is doing is he's consolidating everything that he said. It's almost like the forward in faith section of Ecclesiastes. In 8:16-9:9, and by the way, we're going to cover large sections of this as well. What he's saying is, this doesn't solve all the mystery. There's still enigma. We still don't get it, and we're going to cover that. But there's still enigma. There's still mystery. We haven't unlocked all of this, but we can trust, and he does move us into joy. And that's what we move into the big Carpe Diem passage, forward in faith. We're going to trust God's plan. And then what Solomon does is he moves into a big section on wisdom, and he compares and contrasts how different things and moves us more into a sanctified life. He next moves into some encouragements to investments and to leadership, and we're going to look at those passages as well. So basically saying, forward in faith, cast your bread on the waters, do this thing, live this life that God has given you. And then he has his big closing section, which is 11:7 through really 12:7, and we're going to handle the conclusion to the book separately. And this is where Solomon is really just making the argument that coming death should spur us to live now. So the whole section is saying, live this life. Be done with the enigma. Trust in the enigma. Live in joy. Invest. Work hard. Don't let the enigma stop you from living. And Solomon pushes you along. He pushes you along and pushes you along until you say, okay, I'm going to do it.
and like part 4 is just a huge the whole section is so climactic, and a lot of people think Ecclesiastes is so negative, and I hope that even this really brief overview of the book shows you that it's not. But look at how positive he gets at the end. He's like, invest, plant your crops, sow your seed. He's like, banish anxiety from your heart, cast off troubles, for youth and vigor are meaningless. So he's like, really live, remember your Creator, because you are going to die, and which is actually a really positive thing. We'll go into that more. And then he says that actually everything matters. So like he's got so much vanity in the book, but really then he says at the very end of the book, we'll go into this in more detail later, he's going to bring everything into judgment before God. And so like this is he pushes to a real high note in the last couple chapters of the book, and this is a fantastic book. It's just fantastic. Should we do a little bit of a reprise one more time? Give people those handles so if they give that ball a squeeze, it's not gonna, or that
don't let the pig get away. The county fair.
We just do this again. Yeah, like
ready?
I got it. I'm bringing up part 1 on the screen there.
Part 1, we get oriented to God. God brings our hearts back into Eden, and we are back in a relationship with him. That's part one. Part two, we begin to trust his beautiful saving plan. He addresses the most painful issues. He's leading us to trust the governing of that to him. And this allows us to live our lives without fretting. This is his big conclusion there. He says they seldom reflect on the days of their lives because we're entrusting those painful issues to God. That's part two. Part three, we deepen even further in faith. So we're considering, and we there consider different facets of God's providence and how that it's much better and more righteous than we at first suspect when it comes to prosperity and adversity, when it comes to what we call the good things and to what we call the bad things. We do let God have those things, and we trust that. And this is how joy then accompanies us all the days of our lives. And then that leads us to part four, where we really move into the lives that we have. We grab a hold of them by faith, and it's a life empowered by faith in God and his sovereign plan in our lives.
Woo! There it is. There it is. Thank you for that, Jonathan. That was awesome. That was awesome. Thank you for that. I actually learned a lot just listening to you and just underlining things and reading this book. And maybe once you kind of listen to this episode, one of the best favors you could maybe do to yourself is just take 20 minutes, maybe 25 minutes. It's funny how short you think these books are so long, but
they're not.
You could read this book in the time it would take you to watch an episode of Seinfeld, right? And you would do yourself a favor.
These are not long chapters.
Yeah. Open up the book and just notice some of these things that we've been talking about. The gospel in there, the carpe diems, and really these fantastic. He makes some fantastic spirit-given comments throughout the book. I really can't wait to get into some of these further episodes. But let's just get into what does this give our hearts? Let's bring this home and then kind of we'll let people go and we'll look forward to next week then. But we've seen the problems of trying to nail this book down into a structure. Now we've given handles for it. How does this comfort us?
Well, I got some stuff.
I know you do. Go. So I was like, I put the tee, the ball on the tee, and I'm just waiting for you to.
So this book should give you serenity and trust. It should place you under God in a place where you realize God has given you your life back in your hand, and you're living in the kingdom has now come. I know it's now and not yet. Jesus is going to come back and he's going to make it perfect, but still you do have a life right now that comes to you by grace and because he loves you, and you can just go live that life. Do the good that you can do and enjoy it along the way. And so let me frame this even a little bit further, or another way. What this is the book is a major reorientation for us on issues like suffering, injustice, inequality, and what we do is all that stuff. And we do what we can, we enjoy what we can do, and we receive what God gives us, but we don't fret about it anymore. We let it go. God is God. God has a big, beautiful plan. That's what Solomon's arguing. And we can't control it. God is, and it's good. Let him have it. I think of a comment that Dietrich Bonhoeffer made. He said, when theologizing happened, this is theologizing. We're always thinking all these God questions, debating, skeptics, cynics, questions, all this stuff. When that happened? When the snake came. That's when it happened. And part of what Solomon is doing is he's outing all these questions, all the skepticism, all the cynicism, all the, is God being right? Is this fair? Is this good? And he's outing all the questions. He says, yes, it is. Don't you see it? God is doing it. He is right. And when we get there, then what ends up happening, we stop asking them questions. We can settle in our hearts. That's what I mean by serenity. We can settle in our hearts to these things. And we can just trust God and love people.
Amen. I'm gonna add my own reflection, like to the big broad strokes of the book. We talked about how we want to see the forest instead of the trees. And I just wanted to characterize for a second Solomon as a teacher of wisdom for salvation, which we talked about last time. And the only teacher in my mind that can rival and really far surpasses Solomon in terms of coming to us with teachings that we have to consider fully and that are hard to understand is Jesus. Like he would come to people with these parables, and the disciples would be sitting there like scratching his heads and like, can you explain that to us? And some of the proverbial statements of Jesus, like you can sit there and unpack those things for hours. The first will be last and the last shall be first. Whoever hates his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life will gain it for all eternity. Does that sound anything like Solomon? I mean, to me, like, he is David's greater son. He's Solomon's greater son. And the wisdom that he came with, his saving acts, his death on the cross, his resurrection from the grave, like, it all leads up to that. It's all pointing to Jesus. We talked about that quite a bit last time. But like to kind of pull back and look at the book, and Solomon characterizes as a teacher, only Jesus surpasses him in terms of wisdom and like mashals and proverbial wisdom.
The difference is with Jesus is that he not only gave us beautiful sayings and truthful sayings at the same time, which is exactly what Solomon does here. But our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ lived it from beginning to end.
Solomon
he wasn't
didn't even close.
Just right.
Yeah.
He wasn't just right. He was also beautiful.
Yeah. Should we leave it there? I'm not seeing any questions tonight.
That's the forest for the trees.
Yeah, that's the forest for the trees. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Remember that not Wednesday night next week due to Thanksgiving. We'll leave that as a travel night. Tuesday night, 8 p.m. And we are going to take Injustice. Buckle up. All right. Good night, Jonathan.
Night.
Thanks for listening to the Notable Podcast. You can check out our other seasons on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. If you are enjoying this ministry and are so moved to support it, please visit us at www.thenotablepodcast.com. Thanks for listening.